So welcome everybody to another edition of the Universe Within podcast. Today's episode, I am going to be talking about tobacco. For those of you who have worked with plants in the past, whether it's ayahuasca or San Pedro or really any number of these medicine plants, these master plants, you may be familiar with tobacco. If you haven't, the fact that I'm talking about tobacco may seem very strange, but essentially it's one of the main master plants, and it's one of the plants that's really used in and of itself and also to aid in these other practices. So this episode I'm going to be talking all about tobacco, what it is, where it comes from, the history of it, how one would work with it, why you would work with it, and just really getting into it. This will probably be one of a number of podcasts I do about tobacco, but today I'm just going to go into a little bit of kind of some of the basics and getting into to really what it is and why you would work with it. So I hope you enjoy it. If you're listening to this on YouTube and you could take a second and just hit the subscribe button, that would really help with algorithms and to help to get this show out. And if you're listening to this via audio on Apple Podcast or Spotify, if you could subscribe, and on Apple Podcasts, if you could leave a rating and a really short review, that would really be a big help. So thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. So today we're talking about tobacco. Tobacco is a very interesting plant. As I mentioned in the introduction, it's one of the main plants that's used in this kind of ceremonial work of working with plants. It's an interesting plant because it's a plant that's very well known. Almost everyone has heard of tobacco. Most people, when they think of tobacco, what they're thinking about are cigarettes. So a little bit of history of tobacco. Tobacco, they think, is actually indigenous to what's called the Upper Amazonian Basin, or potentially even a little bit higher, the highlands, where the Amazon Basin begins to go up into the mountains. And there's different varieties of tobacco. The most commonly used is the Latin name is Nicotiana tabacum. The type that's usually used here in the Amazon or here in South America in terms of medicine ceremonies is a variety called Nicotiana rustica, or wild tobacco. Sometimes the first variety is also called blonde tobacco or Virginia tobacco. And you really see it all over the world. When most people think of tobacco, that's what they're thinking about. The Nicotiana rustica version, wild tobacco, or sometimes it's called black tobacco, that you really only find here now in South America. Interestingly, it was the tobacco that was probably found more predominantly throughout the Americas. But when the Europeans came, they actually began by cultivating Nicotiana rustica as well. But over time, they began to switch to the Nicotiana tabacum, and probably because it's milder, it's smoother. So for commercial purposes, it was easier to consume, easier to sell. People could buy more of it. And some people also think it's a hybridized version. And Nicotiana rustica is one of the older versions, but I don't think anyone knows for sure. Some people say it's also a very old species or a very old variety. So interestingly, tobacco when the Europeans came, when the Africans came, when people from kind of the old world came to the new world, although as we're finding more and more, the history of the new world is very old. So who knows which is new and which is old? I think those titles are probably a little bit obsolete. But when they came to the Americas, if one plant had to be singled out as the most widely used medicine plant in all of the Americas, it was tobacco. Tobacco was used as a medicine all throughout the Americas, all the way from Canada all the way down to Chile and Argentina. And it was used by many, many different people, and it was used in different ways, which we'll get into more later. But it was the most widely used medicine plant. Even some of the Inuit in Canada, where they really couldn't grow plants, they would still have trade networks where they would trade to actually acquire this one plant. And that's very fascinating. Because if you think about it, of all the plants they could trade for, they chose to trade for tobacco. And when a lot of the early colonizers came over, even a lot of the early doctors described tobacco really as a panacea, as a plant that had the ability to heal and to cure on many different levels. A lot of the European doctors, it was a very common belief that a lot of sickness resided in the phlegm of the body. And so plants that had the property to expel phlegm were considered very valuable because it was viewed that through expelling that phlegm, you were expelling a sickness. And that may seem kind of crazy, but if any of us have been sick before, if we had the flu or anything like that, what we often see is that we're expelling a lot of phlegm. This is actually something that the body naturally does to cleanse itself. And one of the properties of tobacco is it actually aids in expelling that phlegm. But it was used many different ways. And again, from the early doctors, they also viewed it as a medicine because they had learned that it was a medicine from the indigenous people of the Americas who were using it as a medicine. So one thing, again, a lot of times when we think of tobacco, the image that comes to mind is cigarettes. And cigarettes are tobacco, but unfortunately, in the modern way that they're produced, they're quite removed from the way tobacco was originally used, made, and produced. So the cigarette industry, it's a fairly regulated industry, and at one point I was really looking into this, and I don't know if I remember all of the numbers and percentages exactly, but they're more or less what I'm about to share. But that essentially in any cigarette, what a cigarette consists of, first of all, is what's called reconstituted sheet tobacco. So they'll often take the scraps of the tobacco plant, like the stems and some of the leaves that aren't as desirable, and they'll chop those up, and then they often actually glue them back into what looks like a whole leaf tobacco, and then they'll cut them and they'll use those in cigarettes. Because cigarettes, they're more mass-produced. Most people don't really know or care about the quality of the tobacco. So very often, not only are they using whole leaf tobacco, but they're using what's called reconstituted sheet tobacco. Then, in addition to that, there's many chemicals that are added, and I think like a lot of things, when these chemicals began to be added, they didn't originally originate from nefarious purposes. It wasn't that these tobacco companies were trying to do evil. It was that time in the world where these chemicals they were finding chemicals, they were producing chemicals, things like preservatives, flavor enhancers, chemicals to make it burn more smoothly. So I think a lot of the chemicals that were added initially actually came from a good idea, an idea to make the product better. As years went by and more chemicals were added, then it's probably up to you whether you think some of those chemicals were added for good benefits or potentially for nefarious benefits. But essentially, most cigarettes contain, I think, between 4,000 to 6,000 added chemicals. And when you light that, when you combust it, it produces something like 8,000 chemicals. So there's obviously been some research and a correlation between cigarettes and various diseases. And I'm sure that's a reality. And I think the question is it the tobacco that's causing the disease, or is it one or any number of those potentially 8,000 chemicals? And, certainly we know more and more the deleterious effects of chemicals in the human body. Chemicals in our food, chemicals in our water, chemicals that we're breathing in the air. They can have deleterious effects to the human health. So to imagine that someone is taking a cigarette and often inhaling those 8,000 chemicals into their lungs, it's certainly not surprising that could have very bad effects. Sometimes when I run workshops, I joke, and this may be triggering to some people, but that it's surprising to me that cigarettes don't kill more people. I mean, if you're imagining you're inhaling, who knows how many cigarettes a day, and every one of those cigarettes contain 8,000 chemicals, it's amazing it's not killing more people. And that very well could be because at least there's some tobacco in that cigarette. And again, for the people who originally worked with tobacco, it was considered a medicine plant, a medicinal plant, and not just a medicine, but a medicine of the highest order, actually considered a master plant. The other thing with tobacco, and especially when we're thinking about cigarettes, is usually tobacco there's a process that one needs to undertake in order to cure the tobacco when it's smoked. And if you've ever been to a place where they produce tobacco, you may have seen a tobacco barn. And that was usually the traditional way in which they'd smoke it. They'd take the leaves, the green leaves, they'd hang them up, and then over time, they would allow those to dry by air. And then often they would stack them together and give them some time to ferment and process them and then turn them into cigars or pipe tobacco or cigarettes. What really happened with the cigarette industry is that they developed another way of curing them, which was called flue curing or fire curing. And it was developed because it was a much faster way of producing them. You didn't need the time to air cure the tobacco. And this is anecdotal, but I actually grew up in Virginia. And from my experience talking to a lot of the old tobacco farmers, they would never smoke flue-cured tobacco because they would actually say that's really bad for you. That's not how tobacco was meant to be smoked. And that fire curing, that flue curing of the tobacco actually changes the chemistry of the tobacco. And so again, when people are smoking cigarettes, usually they're smoking flue-cured tobacco rather than the more natural air-cured tobacco. The air-cured tobacco, that's the vast majority of cigars and also pipe tobacco. It's cured in that traditional manner. And that's why also usually they're more expensive too. There's a workmanship, there's an art, there's a craft to getting that final product. So also, with smoking, smoking is one of the more recent ways of actually working with or using tobacco. there's a number of different ways that tobacco can be used, really like any plant, but especially with tobacco, it's processed and used in very different ways. Even where I come from in the U.S., for example, a few hundred years ago, when the Europeans were coming over and the U.S. had been created, maybe this was like the early 1800s or something. Some of the Europeans who came over described, for example, Washington, D.C., which is very close to Virginia, which is where a lot of the tobacco was produced. They would describe Washington, D.C. as this really beautiful city when you looked on a horizontal level. But they said when you looked down on the streets, it was the most disgusting city they had ever seen, because all they saw all around was tobacco juice. And that was a sign of the time, because at that time, actually, people weren't smoking as much. The more common way of using tobacco was actually chewing it. So you take the leaves, often it could be mixed with something else like molasses or maybe vanilla, different flavors. And you would put that in your mouth, and it's called chewing, or probably more like sucking. You would just leave it there, and slowly it would mix with your saliva, and you could spit it out. Some you may swallow. And that was one of the ways of getting the effects of the tobacco without actually inhaling it, just actually working with the juice of the tobacco. Even prior to that, when the Europeans first came to the Americas, when tobacco first went back to Europe, the most common way tobacco was worked with was not chewing or smoking. It was actually snuff, or a powdered form of tobacco. So the leaves would be processed, and then they'd be usually roasted and then ground to a very fine powder. And that powder, often they'd have these little snuff boxes that the European aristocrats would carry around with them, and they would often put a little bit on their hand and they would sniff it. And through the ingestion of the tobacco powder, that was another way of acquiring the effects of tobacco. And that was very commonly practiced. That in the beginning was the most commonly practiced way of using tobacco by foreigners. All of those ways are ways in which they learned from the people of the Americas who were working with tobacco. Those are all ways in which it can be used. It can be smoked, it can be chewed, it can be inhaled in the powder, and it can also be drunk. It can be taken as a liquid, and we'll get into more of that in a bit. But that's actually the most powerful way of working with tobacco. And usually when we talk about working with tobacco, that's what we're referring to. It's much like working with any plant. When you really work with the plant, you're taking it in some liquid form, and you're ingesting that plant into the body. And that's the most powerful way of working with it. So if anyone has maybe been to South America and worked in ayahuasca ceremonies or different ceremonies, you may have seen the doctors. The local name for those they're often called curanderos, one who cures, one who heals, or sometimes they're called médicos, which simply means a doctor. Sometimes they're called healers in English, or also in Spanish, sometimes they're referred to as a maestro. That simply means a teacher. But many people have probably come to South America to, for example, experience ayahuasca and ayahuasca ceremonies. And almost always you will see the curanderos working with tobacco. Now, usually when they're working with tobacco, they're smoking it. And what they're smoking is something called Mapacho. And Mapacho, it's simply the name of the cured tobacco. That's all it is. Again, tobacco is the plant. When you go through the curing process, then they call it Mapacho. And so what a Mapacho looks like usually is like this. It can often also look like a cigar. It's just simply rolled in tobacco leaf. But the most common way that people use it is like this. So as you can see inside, that's tobacco, and then they roll it with a piece of paper. piece of paper is not the best, but it's a cheap way and it's convenient. And so they would smoke that. Sometimes you'll see doctors working with a pipe. They often make a pipe out of wood, some form of a very hard wood, a very strong wood that's able to take the heat. Sometimes they'll use plants as the stem. This is actually a monkey bone, which is one of the traditional ways in which they would make a stem. Probably because it was originally the easiest. If people don't know, monkey is actually one of the main mammals, one of the main food sources of a lot of people in the jungle. Fish, monkey, and there's a couple other mammals, sachavaca, majas, venado, that people hunt and eat. So it may seem strange that people eat monkey, but here in the Amazon, that's one of the main food sources. So when you killed the monkey and ate it, you had these bones left over. So it made a lot of sense to use them because they're already hollow and essentially ready to be used. So you'll often see people working with a pipe as well. I mentioned the powdered form. So if you can see that, often they call it, the most common name that you'll often see the powdered form referred to is rape, or in Portuguese and Brazil, hape. And it's usually simply tobacco that's again been heated over the fire. It gets very brittle, and then you can crush it into a powder. And it's usually mixed with something else. Usually in Spanish they call it ceniza. It's some type of ash from another plant, often various tree barks. And it acts as an activator for the tobacco. Often you'll see it brown. I spent some time with a group called the Matses. They're a group who live on the Peruvian and Brazilian border. When they make it out of the green leaf, and it's very fresh, and it's this bright green color. And they would actually say it begins to lose its power after a couple weeks. So it's something that needs to be used fresh. And so with rape, you'll often see some sort of like self-applicator where you would actually apply it yourself. Traditionally, it was usually just a long, hollow tube, and someone else would apply it to you. And for example, that's how the Matses use it. When I went to them, it's a very long tube, and someone shoots it into your nose. And if anyone has worked with rape before, most of the rape that's sold, that's worked with, is actually quite mild. It maybe gives you a little bit of a jolt, but it's relatively mild. The real rape, like the Matses, it's actually called nuna. That's their name for it. This very bright green powder, and it's very strong, especially when applied with this very long tube, because it's shot with a lot of force, and it often knocks the person back onto their back, and then it's applied often many different times. So that's rape, and again, another way is actually chewing it. So taking the leaves, putting it in the mouth, and then slowly over the day, it's chewed. Some groups will also make a liquid out of it, similar to a tea, something that's very thin, very fine. And in Spanish, they call it chinguear, which kind of means to inhale the liquid. And so you would take that liquid and you would actually inhale it through the nose. I do a lot of work with the Shipibo. They're a group who has a really vast knowledge of working with plants. And that's one of the main ways they use it. They'll often even give it to children to kind of wake them up. If they say the child is very lazy, they'll make them sniff the tobacco liquid, and it makes them alert, and it kind of gives them energy to go work in the field. It's also quite unpleasant, so it's kind of almost a way of disciplining the child. Like if the child does something bad, okay, you're going to have to snort the tobacco now, and then that kind of gets them in alignment. Another way that's often used is It can be called Empiri or ambil. Empiri is usually the resin that's just simply condensed through the heating of the leaf. Often people will extract it through the stem of the pipe. If you've ever smoked a pipe before, you know that you need to clean it once in a while because this resin builds up. Much like the rape, they'll also condense the tobacco down and then mix it with something that activates it. And it's often a salt. Sometimes in the Amazon, they use a plant and they extract from it what's called sal de monte, which is a kind of a natural vegetable salt. And it's a particular plant, and through a processing, you extract this salt. And then you would mix it with the tobacco. You would actually use the fresh leaves, but after boiling them down, mixing them with the sal de monte, it makes this very, very thick paste, and it's very strong. And they'll often refer to this as licking. So if you see some people who work with the paste, you'll often see them actually licking it, kind of like that on the tongue. It can be very strong, so you have to be quite careful with that. Some traditions where they work with tobacco, for example, they'll very often work with other plants too. So in parts of Peru or in Colombia, they'll work with ambil, and then they'll also work with, for example, coca. Coca is considered another master plant, a plant that has a tremendous ability to heal, to teach. So they would take the ambil, they would either lick it or put it on their gums, and then they would take this powdered form of coca. And in many of these traditions, for example, I work with a guy, I'd love to have him on the podcast in the future. His name is Amika, and he comes from a group called the Tubu people, which are around the Valpes area of Colombia. There's a river called the Ep4 River. And there's many groups who live there, and they work with this tobacco paste and coca. And essentially, they say that the tobacco, and this is a very common theme of people who work with tobacco, they would say tobacco is the power. It's what gives power to the word. They would say the coca gives sweetness to the word, and the tobacco kind of acts like a pact. So often in conflict resolution and ceremonies, they would come together as a group in a circle, and they would take ambil, they would take coca, and they would work out their differences. They would share stories. They would bring the community into alignment. They would teach. And two of the most powerful teachers are tobacco and coca. He recounted a story a number of times that for the Tubu people, it's very fascinating. They say they come from Sirius, and that when humans came to the earth, originally there was this primordial canoe, and the canoe was represented by the anaconda. And the anaconda is very symbolic. The snake, the anaconda, is very symbolic in many, many traditions. And that's probably another podcast getting into that. You see this all over the world. You know, the Western medical symbol is a snake going up a pole. Ayahuasca, it's often called the vine of the dead, and it's the ayahuasca vine is represented as a snake. You see it all over the world, and in many traditions, the dragon is very symbolic. And the dragon, if you look at it, the root word I think is draco, and it originally meant snake. And if you look at that etymologically, it's very fascinating, because we often think of this snake as the dragon, the anaconda, as this very kind of dark or menacing thing. And it is. It has a tremendous power. I mean, the poisonous snakes kill who knows how many thousands of people every year just here in South America. But when you look at the etymology of that word, it actually has to do with this idea of light. And it actually means to see to see how something actually is. So it's this very fascinating symbol. Very much, even in this idea of like the hero's journey, going into the darkness, facing the dragon, but that actually what the dragon in its ultimate symbology reveals is actually the light, to see things how they actually are. Sometimes there's this symbology of a mirror, that it reflects ourselves back at us. So that was maybe a bit of a tangent. But this idea of the canoe and the Anaconda represented the original medicine canoe, and that's where all of these plants, they arose from, and they were presented in this canoe to humanity to be able to learn from them, to heal from them. And for the tubu, the original plant, the first plant in that is actually tobacco. And that's a very common mythology. There's many mythologies of people who work with tobacco, and many of them share this common idea that tobacco was actually the primordial plant. It was the plant that God gave to humans, and from that, all other plants arose. And that makes sense on many levels, because often, as many of you know, if you've worked with ayahuasca or other plants, tobacco is always present in the ceremony. So maybe I have a few quotes that I'll read that kind of allude to this a little bit. A couple are a bit long, but I'll read, I think, 4 of them. Just to hear kind of from the people who actually worked with these and the mythologies, what tobacco actually represented for them. This first one comes from a book called the Handbook of South American Indians. And it says, during his instruction, the Andoa, Awishira, Canelo, Roimaina, and the Kandoshi shaman takes Kayapi or Kaspi, ayahuasca, in order to see better. Tobacco, however, gives the true power. So that's from that book. As I mentioned, this kind of creation story, this is from a group called the Witoto. They're mainly in Colombia. There's a group here in Peru, which is called the Bora. They're kind of an offshoot of them. And this was from a book, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, but he's a Witoto, and the name is Rember Yahorakani. And this is their actual creation myth, the creation myth of their people. And he says, when he finished the dream of creation, Buenaima, the creator, left us something to remember him by. He left us tobacco. In this way, we can dream like he dreamt. This plant grew alone by the mound where Buenaima sat, dreaming throughout the night. That's why, when we take tobacco, we concentrate in meditation and think of the gods, and they advise us through our dreams. Tobacco can be smoked, inhaled, and also chewed when it's prepared in a paste made from crushed leaves. We use it with respect and caution because tobacco is a great traveler. Those who have envisioned him in dreams say that he's a very thin man, almost like a skeleton. When he walks in space, aided by a cane, where his leaves grow, and he wears a necklace of skulls and knees. They are the bones of his ancestors, so old and ghostly, like his white smoke. He looks like he's tired, but he keeps walking, always carrying for us the memory of all that has happened since the earth and her creation formed. In dreams, we reconnect to Buenaima, the creator, to Husinguna, the tree child, and to Buinaño, the mother of water, from whom was born all that exists when Buinaima blew and illuminated the water with his white saliva. Since then, Buinaima wears a rainbow in his head of hair and dreams in color, and we also dream, because life is the dream of colors from the Creator. We live and we dream in all colors with which Buinaino is dressed when she stands up, holding the heavens to save us from the storms and make the sun rise and shine again. This next one is from a really excellent and large book called simply Shamanism by, again, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correct, by Mircea Eliade, or Eliade. He's a very well-known anthropologist who did a lot of early work on shamanism. And he says, among the Apanaya shamans are appointed by the soul of a relative, which puts them in relation with the spirits. But it is the latter that impart shamanic knowledge and techniques to them. Among other tribes, one becomes a shaman through a spontaneous ecstatic experience, for example, by having a vision of the planet Mars, and so on. Among the Kampa and the Amawaka candidates are instructed by a living or dead shaman. The apprentice shaman of the Kanibo, that's also the Shipibo Kanibo, of the Ucayali, receives his medical knowledge from a spirit. To enter into relation with the spirit, the shaman drinks a decoction of tobacco and smokes as much as possible in a hermetically closed hut. The Kashinawa, which is another group, the Kashinawa candidate is taught in the bush. Souls give him the requisite magical substances and also inoculate his body with them. The Yaruo, another group, their shamans, are taught by their gods, although they learn techniques proper from other shamans. But they do not consider themselves able to practice until they have met a spirit in dream. In the Apapakuva Guarani tribe, the prerequisite for becoming a shaman is learning magical songs, which are taught by dead relatives in dreams. But whatever the source of their revelation, all of these shamans practice in accordance with the traditional norms of their tribes. In other words, they conform to rules and a technique that they can have acquired only by going to school to men of experience. This is equally true of any other shamanism. As we see, if the dead shaman's soul plays an important role in the development of shamanic vocation, it only prepares candidates for later revelations. The souls of dead shamans put him in relation with spirits or carry him to the sky. These first ecstatic experiences are followed by teachings received from the old shamans. Among the Selknam, another group, spontaneous vocation is manifested by the young man's strange behavior. He sings in his sleep and so on. But such a taste can also be obtained voluntarily. All that is necessary is to see the spirits. Seeing spirits in dreams or awake is the determining sign of the shamanic vocation, whether spontaneous or voluntary. For, in a manner, having contact with the souls of the dead signifies being dead oneself. This is why, throughout South America, the shaman must so die, that he may meet the souls of the dead and receive their teachings. For the dead know everything. As we said, shamanic election or initiation in South America sometimes preserves the perfect schema of a ritual death and resurrection, but the death can also be suggested by other means: extreme fatigue, tortures, fasting, blows, and so on. When a young Jivaro, that's another group here in Peru, they're also the Shuar, the Ashwar, decides to become a shaman, he looks for a master, pays him his proper fee, and then embarks on an extremely severe regime. For days, he does not touch food and drinks narcotic beverages, especially tobacco juice, which is well known to play an essential part in the initiations of South American shamans. Finally, a spirit, Pasuka, appears to the candidate in the form of a warrior. The master immediately begins to strike the apprentice until he falls to the ground unconscious. When he comes to himself, his whole body is sore. This proves that the spirit has taken possession of him, and in fact, the sufferings, intoxications, and blows have brought on his loss of consciousness are in a manner assimilated to a ritual death. It follows that the souls of the dead, whatever the part they have played in precipitating the vocation or initiation of future shamans, do not create the vocation by their mere presence, possession or not, but serve the candidate as a means of entering into contact with divine or semi-divine beings through ecstatic journeys to the sky and the underworld, etc., or enable the future shaman to share in the mode of being of the dead. This has been very well brought out by Marcel Mauss in connection with magical powers being conferred on Australian sorcerers by supernatural revelation. Here, too, the role of the dead often overlaps that of pure spirits. And indeed, even when it is the spirit of a dead man that directly grants the revelation, the latter implies either the initiatory rite of the killing of the candidate followed by his rebirth, or ecstatic journeys to the sky, a peculiarly shamanic theme in which the ancestral spirit plays the role of psychopomp and which, by its very structure, excludes possession. It certainly seems the chief function of the dead in granting of shamanic powers is less a matter of taking possession of the subject than of helping him to become a dead man. In short, helping him to become a spirit too. And this last one, shorter, it's from a book called The Master Plant. And there's a chapter called From Gifts of the Deities to Scourge Among Humans, and it was written by Robin Wright, who I believe is an anthropologist as well. In their ancestral emergence stories, the Bainiwa, primordial shaman, blew sacred smoke over the umbilical cords of the very first ancestors to protect them from any harm. The umbilicus unites all generations to their ancestral sources. Each ancestors received its own spirit name for sacred tobacco. The same sacred tobacco is invoked in post-birth chants, which elders perform for newborn children and their families, when they search for the ancestral names to bestow upon the newborn, and when they initiate young children into adulthood. In the last mentioned, chanters perform the most elaborate thought journeys done since the beginning of the world, in which their souls travel among the paths of sacred place names created by tobacco smoke, departing from the center of the world, voyaging by leaps and bounds through the ancestral spirit world to all known ends of the world to leave sacred music. Once they have compelled the cycle of journeys, they return along the sun's path to the center of the world, bringing back the sacred tobacco. These tobacco voyages protect initiates from harmful spirits, leaving their bodies strong and resistant to pain and sickness. And this final one is very simple. I think this was by Jeremy Narby, and he said a Ashaninka shaman said this to him. And it's simply, tobacco shows me the reality of things. I can see things as they are, and it gets rid of all the pains. So, that was probably a lot. But there's some very common themes in there. One, again, much like the primordial canoe of the Tubu people, is this idea that tobacco is this ancestral knowledge. It's the first plant. It's the plant that connects people to their ancestors. It's also a plant that allows someone to voyage, to enter what we would call the shamanic realm. And I think I talked a little bit about this in one of the previous podcasts, but essentially that's what all of these plants are doing. All of these plants that we would call entheogens or master plants, is they're allowing us to access altered states of consciousness. And I think, as I mentioned, if people haven't worked with these plants, that may sound like something very strange, almost even taboo. But again, it's not only a part of the human being, it's essential to the human being. Our consciousness is always changing. Again, it's never static. That's entropy. things are always moving, things are always evolving, things are always changing, shifting, evolving. That's one of the fundamental principles of the universe. And so in that way, that's the same with our consciousness. Our consciousness is never static. It's always moving. It's always changing. It's always evolving. One of the other really interesting things that was alluded to in a lot of this was this idea of sleep, of dreams. And very much one of the qualities of working with tobacco is it's taking us into this dream state. And that's essentially a highly, highly altered state of consciousness. It's just something we take for granted because we do it every single night. It's a third of our lives we spend in this extremely altered state of consciousness. Also, as they alluded to many times, it's this death-like state. Very much when we're dreaming, for all intents and purposes, our bodies are dead. They're comatose. There's nothing going on. And yet inside, the consciousness is very active. It's working, it's doing, it's traveling, it's fixing things. And so essentially, tobacco is also putting us into that space, but it's putting us into that space where we're very conscious of that, we're very aware of that, which is often very different, because often in dreams, we're conscious in the moment, but we're not conscious of this reality. Our entire reality is in that dream space, much like in this waking space, our entire reality is this waking space. It's often said the role of the shaman is to have one foot in both of those worlds. And essentially, tobacco is one of the mediums that allows him to do that. So often under the influence of tobacco, whether it's drinking it or, as was mentioned once, drinking and smoking large, copious amounts of tobacco, or working with a lot of the paste, but taking these very large doses of tobacco, one enters into an altered state of consciousness. And it's putting one in that space very much like the dream space, but it's that idea of one foot is in that space and one foot is still here. So there's an awareness of both. And in that way, the shaman, the curandero, is actually able to work. Common themes that are described by people who work with tobacco, and again, it can be very personal, it can be different, but there's often very common archetypical themes, and some of these were mentioned in some of those quotes that I read. One is this idea of power. Like in the first quote, it was said that ayahuasca is what allows the curandero to see. It's what allows him to have a vision, to open himself so that he can see potentially non-ordinary things. He can see things that aren't just in this reality. But as that first quote said, the tobacco is where his power comes from. And that's a very common theme of when people begin to work with tobacco. They very much describe this sense of power. And again, when I'm referring to working with tobacco, I'm not referring to smoking cigarettes. That's really nothing to do with it. Although, I would imagine one of the reasons people smoke cigarettes is because there is still some tobacco in there, and they are experiencing some of those effects. One of the interesting things about tobacco is it's one of a very few plants that can actually work both as a stimulant and a depressant. So it can actually almost relax the body, but it stimulates the inside. It stimulates the mind. And you see that a lot, for example, with writers or sometimes people who are creative. There's often this stereotype of coffee and cigarettes because it stimulates the mind. It stimulates the creativity. It puts us in a level where we're accessing other things. Some people may call it a flow state. And if you look at many, even of the early Europeans that came, they had a reverence for tobacco. Many artists, people who you may not even think of, like, for example, Bach, one of the greatest composers, he swore by tobacco. He wrote an ode to tobacco, which you can probably find if you look online. So, even with smoking, And again, most of them were not smoking cigarettes, they were smoking pipe tobacco. But they were still experiencing the effects of tobacco, because again, that's one of the ways in which we experience the properties of tobacco. So this sense of power, much like with this example of Bach, another one of the archetypal qualities that people experience when they work with tobacco is a sense of clarity. This was also one of the things that was alluded to in one of those quotes, is the ability to see things as they actually are. So not to see things like we think they are, or how we want them to be, or how we believe them to be, or how someone told us that they should be, but we see things how they actually are. This is also, if anyone's practiced Vipassana, this is essentially what this means: seeing things as they actually are. Seeing things without all of these filters that we usually place over things. And this is something we very commonly do. We look at a tree and we say, oh, that's an oak tree. There's a use to that. There's a use in dividing and differentiating things. There's a way that we can learn and grow from that. But essentially, from this more holistic or shamanic point of view, when we do that, we're creating a split, we're creating a division, we're creating a me and the tree, and that tree is other. And in that sense, I begin to lose the connection. I begin to lose the union. I begin to see it as something outside of myself, something other than myself. And to many people, that may sound very strange. Like, of course, a tree is way different from me. But also what some of these quotes are alluding to is this idea of spirit. That the essence of these things, the essence of who we are, the essence of what that tree is, as we go into that division, that separation begins to become smaller and smaller. And that's often a very difficult process. We often think about that as something like love and light and, union, it's beautiful and bliss. And it can be that. But what was also alluded to in these was this idea that it's a very difficult process. It's a process of dying. Because through that shamanic initiation, through that process of dying, what we're doing is shedding those layers of who we think we are. I am this. I am Jason. I am a man. I am from this country. I like this. I don't like this. Da-da-da-da-da. And when those begin to become shed away, it may sound like something very beautiful, like, oh, I'm getting close to God, or union. But often that's a terrifying process. Because everything we think we know to be true begins to fall away. And in a sense, there's nothing left to grasp onto. As Jesus says, to enter the kingdom of heaven, even the clothes on our body, we have to be willing to stand on those. And that's where these shamanic initiations, working with plants, it's again this very archetypical hero's journey. It's a very difficult process. It's going into the darkness, going into the shadows, facing the dragon, which is again where we project all of our fears, all of our anxieties. And again, as I mentioned earlier in another podcast, there's no one without fear. If I believe that I exist separate from any other thing, there's inherently fear there. There's a separation. There's a me and a something else. That creates a split. And on the most fundamental level, these plants give us an ability to go into that. And for people who have gone deeply into that, it's often a very harrowing process. Because again, literally the world can begin to fall away. There's nothing left to hold on to. There's not my name anymore. There's not my body. There's not even a sense of me. Everything is dissolved. And that takes a tremendous courage to be able to stand in the face of the great unknown, in North American terms, the great mystery, to stand in the face of that and be willing to dissolve completely into that. And so in many of these shamanic practices, it's often called a process of, again, what was alluded to, a process of dying, because through this process of death, there's a rebirth. And often that has to happen many times. It's a constant process of letting go. It's a constant process of dying to what actually is reality, seeing things like they actually are. So that's another really big quality of tobacco: power, clarity, strength, groundedness. In many of these traditions, again, like in that first quote, there's often a requisite of acquiring power, of acquiring strength through the working with tobacco in order to be able to have the strength, the fortitude, to be able to work with some of these other plants that really take us into that depth. And do we have the power to actually be able to remain in the center when all of these things are coming, when all of these things are falling away? Do I have that power to be able to remain in the center? A very Buddhist concept, the middle way, without going too much that way, without falling that way. Can I remain in the center? Can I bear witness? Can I see things as they actually are? Can I observe them as they pass, rather than getting caught up in the myriad, the infinite possibilities of what can begin to arise? So those are really common qualities that people talk about when they begin to work with tobacco. What was also said in some of these is when one begins to work with a plant, and it doesn't have to be just tobacco, but when one begins to enter that shamanic initiation, which especially in this part of the world, that often involves tobacco, it's an initiatory experience. It's often very long. It's very arduous. There's deprivation. There's isolation, fasting, really weakening the body to the point where it is almost in that near-death experience. And then in that very weakened, very open state, ingesting these very strong plants, which then really amplifies their effect. And it takes us, one could say, to these primordial states where we begin to work out what is real, what's not real, where we begin to enter into these altered states where, again, as this was said, where we have access to these other realms. We're able to voyage to other worlds, to other states, to see ancestors, to take that knowledge and to bring it back, and then to learn to begin to embody that, so that we're able to be a more whole, a more complete human being, and then through that, being able to share that. Whether it's doing this work or not even doing this work, but just as a whole human being, being able to live one's life in accordance with these truths. So the process of learning from tobacco is this initiatory experience. Long periods of fasting, long periods of isolation. It's the main initiatory experience that I did. I worked with someone who's what's called a tabaquero, one who works with tobacco. And again, here you have many different levels of curanderos. You have tabaqueros, one who works with tobacco; ayahuasquero, one who works with ayahuasca; sananguero, one who works with sanango. And so that's a very long process, and one that I became quite familiar with. And it's a very arduous process. Just that idea, again, of being in isolation, being on one's own, fasting for long periods of time, and ingesting tobacco, it's very difficult. Now, often, I think it was show number 3, I talked a bit more about this process of dieting, of learning from plants. And essentially any plant can be dieted. Any plant has its spirit, it has its medicine, it has its quality. So often, with tobacco, for example, the process of the initiatory experience is often first ingesting tobacco and then beginning to ingest other plants. In the tradition that I went through, it was trees. Because again, trees are considered the power. It's the power that the shaman acquires, and again, it's this archetypical symbol, as above, so below. That the tree represents this bridge between the underworld and the heavens. Its roots go into the ground, and its branches are moving up towards the sky, up towards the heavens. So it's very symbolic in that way. It's very symbolic too because, again, a tree starts as a seed, it begins to shoot up, it's still very fragile, it needs care, it needs nurturing. Over time it grows and it gets stronger, and eventually it starts giving back, it starts flowering, it starts producing fruit. We can begin to use the tree, to use the bark, to use pieces of it, to build bows and arrows or blowguns, or to build your house. It's giving back. And eventually that tree becomes this unshakable presence. It's something that's rooted into the ground, and it's moving towards the heavens. And even in the storms, in waves of emotion and turmoil, it stands strong. Also with trees, they all have their own medicine property. And this was something that was used all over the world. If you look at the traditions of the Druids, and there's so many traditions where the tree was not only very symbolic, but it was medicinal. And many trees are very strong medicine. They have properties of really cleansing the body, of purifying the blood, of cleansing the intestines. Every tree has its own medicine. So with that initiatory experience, the way to ingest that tree was mixing it also with the juice of tobacco. Because again, if tobacco was the primordial plant, then when the tobacco is mixed with the tree and ingested, you're gaining access to the wisdom or the spirit of the tree through the ingesting of tobacco. In many traditions, they would say that the spirit of plants likes the spirit of tobacco. Also, when we ingest tobacco, it has its own effect. Again, it's a very strong purgative. It very effectively cleanses the body, cleanses the intestine, cleanses the blood, which again is where a lot of this sickness comes from. It expels this phlegm. And then on top of that, we add a medicine plant that we're dieting, again, as they were saying here, in essence, to learn from or to unite with or to see the spirit of that tree, so that in a sense that becomes our ally. And again, that may sound very strange, but again, in that altered state of consciousness, in that altered state of reality, where we have access to these other ways of being, these other ways of seeing, that becomes more clear. So that's the initiatory experience of working with something like tobacco. Again, the way that one works with tobacco is through the ingestion of the juice, and then that can also be aided by smoking as well, or taking paste. But it's the drinking of the liquid that's the shaman or the curandero, that's his way in which he begins to build a relationship with tobacco. Now, also, as was said, it's very important that one always works with a teacher, that one does not work with these things on their own. Because as tobacco is very strong, and I mentioned this in one of the previous podcasts, this idea from Paracelsus, the difference between medicine and poison is in the dose. And all of these plants that we consider master plants, they're medicine, but in the wrong dose, they're poison, they're toxic. Because they are putting us in this very altered state, we have to be very careful with the dose, that we don't take too much. We have to know exactly how to prepare it, how to administer it, what foods can be eaten, how frequently it can be taken, when it can be taken, how someone needs to be worked with when they're in that altered state of consciousness. All of those things are essential. And without doing that, one is really opening oneself to danger on a physical level, on a mental, emotional level, on a spiritual level. All of these plants have always been taught from someone who knows how to work with them. And that's super important to remember. So that's a bit about tobacco. Again, it can be a bit confusing because usually when we think about tobacco, we're thinking about cigarettes. And that's not the way we're referring to working with tobacco here. One of the other qualities, and again, this may be something that many people have seen if they've come and they've worked with ayahuasca, is often the curanderos, you'll see them smoking a lot, smoking from their pipes, smoking mapachos. And that has, there's a reason behind that too. Again, this idea that tobacco is giving them their power. And again, with these archetypical qualities of tobacco, they would say that when they're working, for example, with ayahuasca, the tobacco is aiding them to connect to the spirits of the plants that they're working with, that they're summoning. One of the other qualities of tobacco is this idea of protection. So you'll often see the curanderos blowing smoke over their body. They're protecting themselves. It also has this quality of cleansing. So also by blowing smoke over themselves, blowing smoke in the space. When they're working with someone, you'll see them often blowing smoke on someone. And again, it's this idea of cleansing them, of cleansing them of these energies, which you can think about that however you want, but again, in that altered state, one is potentially more able to perceive these things, and tobacco is really their aid. For many people, it's their only aid. As I was saying, I work with a lot of shipibo, and in ceremony, they only have two physical tools. They have a number of tools that are within them that they use. When they ingest ayahuasca and they begin to work, the predominant tool that they use is what's called the ícaro. It's the song. And I'm sure we'll get much more into this in another episode, but essentially they would say that song, it was either taught to them by their teacher or it was taught to them directly through the dieting of a plant. They began to experience a melody, and then potentially words came, or they added words. And this ícaro, this song came, that essentially is the verbal transmission, the melodic transmission of the essence of this plant. And so in ceremonies, they're singing that healing song to their patient. And it's fascinating because that's the main tool that they use to do their work. Is this song, which is essentially like the bridge between their diet, the medicine that they carry, and how they transmit that and heal the patient. They often have two more tools that they use that are within them. One is the soplar, it's the breath, which is often aided by the two physical tools that they use. One is tobacco, and two is often a perfume. It could be a perfume that they made themselves, or often you'll see them working with a commercial perfume. Florida water is really the most common one. So through the soplar, through the breath, and again, the breath is very symbolic, or metaphorically very symbolic. The breath is spirit. When you look at the etymology of spirit, it's breath. Breath is what sparks life. When we're born, the breath is the first thing that animates life. And when we die, the breath is the thing that transitions us out of life. So through the soplar, which in Spanish simply means to blow, one is transmitting that essence of life. And that's aided with either tobacco or their perfume. And then their third tool is called the chupar, which means to suck or to take out. So often in that altered state, if they feel there's something stuck, a blocked energy, they energetically may try and suck that out. And again, that's aided by very often tobacco. They would smoke tobacco, swallow it, and some curanderos, through a process of dieting particular plants, they may build this internal phlegm, which in Spanish is often called mariri. And they would say it's this phlegm which is built, and they can call it to rise by smoking and swallowing the tobacco, so that then when they energetically suck out the illness of someone, that mariri, that phlegm, acts as a barrier. And then they essentially trap or take that energy themselves, and through the mariri, then they spit it out or they vomit it out. That may sound really crazy if you've never partaken in an ayahuasca ceremony or in an ayahuasca ceremony where people actually are doing that work. But again, with many of the Shipibo curanderos, they simply have two physical tools. There's not like a bunch of rocks and crystals and posters and pictures. It's just their tobacco and their perfume. So even for them, tobacco is this very powerful ally, this very powerful tool. And you really see this in so many traditions. In North America, there's this idea of the pipe or the peace pipe. And again, often people would come together in a circle, and before anything was said, ritually that pipe was passed around, and one had to ingest the smoke of the pipe, because it was said, again, these archetypical qualities of truth, of giving power to the word, of making a pact with the word, that once we smoked tobacco, our words became pure, they became grounded, they came from a place not necessarily of the mind, but from someone deeper. And then once we said those words, once we resolved a conflict, or once I gave my word that I was going to do something, then the tobacco acted almost like a pact. It was like a seal that said, now I have said this. And that's my word. And in many, many older cultures, our word, it was said that that's all we had. All we had as a human being was our word. And again, this is very symbolic. You find this in Christianity, the word. In the beginning, there was the word. It comes from the breath. But essentially, that this is the only thing that we actually have is our word. It's what we say. If I'm going to do this, and I say I'm going to do this, that's my word. And if I don't do that, then my word means nothing. And that's often, even today, we sign things. We sign our name on something. And essentially, that's what we're saying. We're saying, I give my word. I'm putting my name, I'm putting who I am on this document, and I'm saying, I am going to do this. I'm saying I agree to this. And that comes from that idea of the power of the word. Often, there was a handshake. That was the same thing. We shake hands, we make a deal, and then we shake hands, and that's a pact. And even before handshaking, there was just simply the verbal word. Yes, I will do that. I give my word. And in many of these cultures, the lowest state a person could have is someone who doesn't have a word, someone who doesn't honor their word. And often that meant almost on a level that they weren't a person. If a person didn't have their word, then they had no meaning, they had no value. And very much that's also embodied in the work of tobacco. Again, the sense of groundedness, of clarity, of this pact of I say what I do. This is my word. This is who I am. And that's also power. There's a tremendous power when I do what I say. When I honor my word, that's power. There's a strength in that. When I don't honor my word, I'm vulnerable to so many things because I'm open. There's nothing solid that protects me because I've opened myself to not honoring my word, and then I'm susceptible to all of the things that come from that. But if I honor my word, then there's a sense of strength, a sense of power. There's nothing to be affected by. This is what I said, and I did it. It's solid. It's simple. It's powerful. It's profound. So maybe we'll leave it at that. I think that's a nice kind of introduction to tobacco. There's a lot that can still be said, but I'll definitely be doing more episodes on tobacco. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that sparked some curiosity, maybe answered some questions. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section or send an email to the Universe Within podcast. There's a page on there where you can send a message. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed that. Tobacco it's a very interesting subject. Again, it's one of the main, if not the main plant that's been worked with as a medicine throughout the history of the Americas. And I'm sure I could talk a lot about it, and I'll talk more about it. But like I said, I hope that was a good introduction, and it sparked some curiosity. Just a reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you can subscribe, that's a big help. If you're watching this on Apple, if you can just hit one of those stars and leave a rating and just take a couple minutes and leave a review, that would be a really big help. And also, if you enjoy this and you'd like to support, it would be a really big help if you could become a Patreon supporter. I think for like as little as $1 a month, you can help to keep the show going. And the really nice thing about Patreon is there's a lot of added benefits to that. I'll be putting out some material that's exclusive to Patreon. So if you help to give through Patreon, you'll have access to that. Probably extended versions of some of these, a chance to ask questions directly that are answered. And also early access to these episodes. So it's just a really good way to help support this work and then also to receive something back. And so for any of you who are already a part of Patreon and many of you have even directly donated to this podcast, thank you very much. That's really appreciated, and it helps to keep these shows coming. I'm looking to probably, as I'm not really working right now, probably do about 2 of these shows a week now. And I have some really good guests coming up. Probably the next 4 or 5 shows are all going to be me interviewing people. I'm going to be interviewing a colleague of mine who also works with tobacco, and she's very knowledgeable, and she'll be able to share things from a different point of view, so that should be really good. I'm going to be interviewing a guy who I've worked with a lot. He does cognitive behavioral therapy, and he does a lot of work with integration, so integrating this work, this plant work, back into people's lives. And that's a question I get a lot, and it's something that I think a lot of people are focusing on is how to integrate all that we learn back into our lives. And that's what he does for a living, and he's a good friend of mine, and I think he'll be able to share a lot, and you'll learn quite a bit from him. I'll also be doing an interview with a former facilitator, a lady who facilitates and runs ceremonies who I used to work with, and she's great. She's a ball of energy and light, and I think she has a lot to share, so that should be really good. I'll be interviewing 2 people who actually run plant ceremonies here where I'm shooting this, in the Sacred Valley of Peru. And they're just amazing people, and they do really good work, and they have a wealth of information to share. And then I'm also hoping to get on a Shipibo curandera, who I've worked with for a long time, and she's amazing. She's also just a ball of light and energy. It's actually what her Shipibo name means. Yeah, she has a wealth of information, and it's always so nice to hear from someone who really comes from a long lineage of working with these plants, and she works day in and day out. This is what she does. So I've seen her grow tremendously, and she's helped me a lot. She's a really beautiful woman, and just an abundance of knowledge. So that should be a really good podcast. So that's it. Thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I will see you on the next episode.